This is Politics UK. I'm Charlotte Wright. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the Rwanda Bill ping-pongs between the Commons and the Lords. Will migrants entering the UK illegally ever board a plane?
The purpose of the bill is to make clear that Rwanda is safe generally and that decision makers, as well as courts and tribunals, must conclusively treat it as such.
This con of a bill is not the way to fix the problems that this Conservative government has created. The highest court in our land has ruled unanimously that Rwanda is not a safe country.
Election fever grips Prime Minister's questions.
Why is the Prime Minister so scared to call an election?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in January, my working assumption is that the election will be in the second half of the year.
The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, says the benefits system needs reform.
We do need to keep looking at welfare reform because I think it is incredibly destructive to society if a system ends up parking people outside the world of work.
And Wales has a new First Minister, Vaughan Gething, the first black leader of a national government in Europe.
Our Parliament and our government should look like our country.
Well, it was a week dominated by the Rwanda Bill that would allow migrants entering the UK illegally to be put on planes to East Africa. The House of Lords had heavily amended the government's bill, which this week returned to the House of Commons and then went off back to the Lords again. Susan, what shape is it in now?
Well, not in any shape that the government want to see. So just remember, before a bill can become law, it's got to be agreed by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Now, when the Safety of Rwanda Bill went to the House of Lords, there are a lot of peers there who really don't like what it does, which is declaring that Rwanda is safe for asylum seekers. So they made a lot of changes to it. When the bill came back to the Commons at the beginning of this week, the government said these changes have actually destroyed the bill. So they got the Conservative majority there to undo it all. That means it's got to go back for approval to the House of Lords. Peers like that? No, they said, we're not happy with it. And they put their changes in it once again. So we've got this back and forward, and it's not over yet. We're going to keep going after Easter as well, because Parliament's taking a break after Easter. So it does look like those flights to Rwanda aren't going to take off anytime soon. But let's take a look first at what happened in the Commons when the government was trying to get Conservative MPs to put their bill back the way they wanted it.
The purpose of the bill is to make clear that Rwanda is safe generally and that decision makers, as well as courts and tribunals, must conclusively treat it as such. The amendments, as drafted, would open the door to lengthy legal challenges which will delay removal.
This con of a bill is not the way to fix the problems that this Conservative government has created. The highest court in our land has ruled unanimously that Rwanda is not a safe country, and no amount of ludicrous legislation like this bill can change that fact. The government may well wish to say that the sky is green and the grass is blue, but introducing an Act of Parliament will never make it so.
There needs to be more protections put into this bill to ensure that children who have already gone through incredibly traumatic experiences do not get sent to Rwanda.
Why are this bill so needed, and why is it essential that we stop these wrecking amendments? That is because for far too long we've got far too many illegal immigrants coming into our country. These illegal immigrants who are jumping the queue, going outside the rules and regulations of how they should be coming to our country, are just making it harder and harder for people in this country.
What this debate and these Lords amendments really should be focusing on are the provisions in the bill, but also ensuring that the Migration and Economic Development Partnership And that is what it's called with Rwanda, can be operationalised and delivered as planned. I am very concerned that some of the amendments that have been tabled will effectively, they're down to derail the bill as it stands.
I'd be astonished if any of it actually makes any significant difference at the end of the day, because this is not about law, it's not even about really a meaningful approach to the problem of votes in the Channel. It's all about politics in the run-up to the election.
Let us suppose for the moment that we suspend our disbelief, if we suspend our notice of all the evidence right now that suggests that Rwanda is not safe. Even if it were, how on earth can we be legislating that it will be into the future for any degree of indefinite time? That just seems, there is so much, frankly, in this bill that is just an affront to common sense.
I would expect the government to be very sensible and sensitive to the position of Afghan refugees, any future refugees, and not put them into this scheme. It does seem to me to lose nothing by adding this particular insertion. So for those reasons, these amendments are frankly a curate's egg, as all Lord's amendments are going to be. But there are times, Mr Deputy Speaker, where I do think it is important that a point is made. And I'm afraid this is one of those occasions where I'm going to make that point.
MPs there discussing the Rwanda Bill. Thank you, Susan. We'll come back to you again shortly. Let's go to Edinburgh now, though, and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, new hate crime legislation that's about to come into force has led to concerns about free speech, hasn't it?
That's right. This is the Hate Crime and Public Order Act that was actually passed 3 years ago in 2021 at Holyrood, but it comes into force from the 1st of April this year. Now, the Act creates new offences of stirring up hatred on the grounds of age, disability, religion, sexual orientation or gender identity. And concerns have been raised both at the time it was going through Holyrood and now as it comes into force about the possibility that it could have a chilling effect on free speech. Concerns have been raised, for example, that perhaps women's rights campaigners could be prosecuted for saying that a trans woman is a man or saying people can't change sex. Concerns have also been raised about the effect on already overstretched police resources if there are a lot of new complaints under this Act. Now, the Scottish Conservatives have opposed this legislation, and Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross brought this up at First Minister's Questions, predicting the Scottish Government might have to backtrack. But First Minister Humza Yousaf said that the Scottish Conservatives should put more effort into opposing hate rather than opposing hate crime legislation.
We've said from the outset this law is a disaster in the making. It criminalises free speech. It risks a fundamental right. It's overreach by the SNP into people's homes. It could result in the public being criminalised for no good reason. It is set to be a shambles.
Let's hear Mr Ross.
It is set to be a shambles from day one in just 11 days' time. So will Humza Yousaf finally accept that he has created another bad SNP law that will quickly descend into chaos?
First Minister.
What's dangerous, Presiding Officer, isn't the law. What's dangerous is hate crime in our society, Presiding Officer. You see, Presiding Officer, we did debate this Act when it was, of course, a bill going through this Parliament extensively. Many years ago, robust debate. Actually, I thought debate is sometimes and often the best traditions of this Parliament. There was compromises. There was amendments that were accepted by the government. We came out of that process with a good piece of legislation that fundamentally protected people's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also safeguarded people's right not to have hatred stirred up against them. And of course, there was only one party that opposed that bill, Douglas Ross and the Conservative Party. And maybe, Presiding Officer, it's hardly a surprise, given that the Conservative Party, far from working hard to tackle hatred, they're a party that have actively created the conditions for hatred and division to thrive in our society.
Now, Humza Yousaf is personally very committed to this Act. It went through Parliament while he was Justice Secretary and responsible for it. He said there are protections within the Act that mean people wouldn't be prosecuted simply for expressing an opinion. And he's also said that hate crime legislation isn't new because racial hatred has been an offence since 1986. But as this is about to come into force in 10 days' time, it does remain controversial.
OK, and a report on Scottish Government climate targets published this week was bad news for the Scottish Government, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. This was a report by the Climate Change Committee, an independent committee, saying that the Scottish Government's target of reducing climate-harming emissions by 3/4 by 2030 was now impossible to achieve effectively. The committee said that the increase in the reduction of emissions between now and 2030 was now beyond what is credible. It also criticised the Scottish Government for delaying its next climate change plan from last year to this year, saying that that had meant there was a significant period without sufficient actions or policies to reach that target. Now, in an urgent question at Holyrood this week, Net Zero Secretary Mary McCallan was asked whether that 2030 target was now being dropped.
To govern is to prioritise, and it's evident that the SNP and Greens have been chasing headlines, not environmental results. Why else would we be in a situation where 8 of the past 12 statutory emissions targets have been failed, and the 2030 target looks doomed to failure as well? So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm if the Scottish Government has now abandoned the 2030 target?
We are actively considering all options in respect of the views of the Committee on Climate Change as set out today, including legislation. But I think I must remind Maurice Golden a bit of context, and in particular the fact that his party in the UK Government has fought to open coal mines whilst at the same time failing to commission on and offshore wind in England, whilst we have moved.
Let us hear the Cabinet Secretary.
In Scotland. Set that against what the Scottish Tories have done in this Parliament, standing in the way of even modest measures that the Scottish Government has sought to bring forward. Low emission zones, workplace parking, DRS. Maurice Golden really ought to do some soul-searching over the contribution that him and his party have made to the progress on climate change.
Mary McCallan was also asked if she would bring forward that next climate change plan from its final deadline of November this year. She refused to do that, but she said the government was actively considering its next steps and considering the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change. She also said that all options were being considered and they were committed to reaching net zero by 2045.
Now, Jenny, also published this week were new statistics on school attendance, and they showed high levels of absence. What's behind those figures?
Yes, the figures this week on persistent absence, which is pupils missing at least 10% of the school year, were quite concerning. They show that on average around 1/3 of school pupils were persistently absent. That's around a quarter of primary school pupils and around 4 in 10 secondary pupils. But there was quite a great deal of regional variation in those figures, with 3 council areas having more than half of secondary pupils persistently absent. Now, Education Secretary Jenny Go-Ruth was giving evidence to the Education Committee this year, and she linked this issue of absence with other problems such as attainment and poor behaviour that have been increasing problems since the COVID pandemic.
I'm just wondering if you consider there's been enough focus and investment to support children, particularly those with anxiety, to re-engage with learning following the pandemic and the isolation elements, etc., that took place due to that.
I think more generally, and I know the committee's taken evidence on this, we've seen a real uptick in relation to dysregulated behaviour. I spoke to some of the challenge in some of our youngest citizens, so speech and language delays. We see in the behaviour in Scottish schools research that published in November some really challenging behaviour in some of our youngest citizens. So primary 4, age 8, some real challenges. with behaviour and relationships that we would not have seen before the pandemic. And again, I hope we go back to this, but we've got real challenges just now on attendance, and I would encourage the committee to look at the local level data, the variance across the system, whereby we have a local authority in Scotland 50% of young people in secondary are persistently not attending school. That means they're missing 10% of the school year. That's a significant amount of learning. You can't hope to respond to challenges in relation to behaviour or attainment or attendance without having your young people in front of you. So I think these issues that Mr Kidd talks to are all intrinsically linked post-pandemic.
Jenny Garuth said there wasn't a magic wand to solve these problems, and she said that for some pupils, coming to school was still extraordinarily challenging. But she did mention that some schools were very successful in building relationships, using a member of staff to build relationships with pupils and with families, that over a course of weeks was persuading pupils to come back into school.
OK, Jenny Davidson at Holyrood, thank you very much for the update. Let's go back to Westminster now and to our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hugh. And Susan, at Prime Minister's Questions this week, there was a distinct feeling that the election campaign had unofficially started, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. We've got many months of this to come, I reckon. I was up in the press gallery in the chamber, sitting up above the MPs, and it was so noisy at times. I actually couldn't hear anything they were saying. I had to go back and listen to the recordings to make out what it was that they'd been saying. The Labour leader, as you might imagine, put a lot of focus on the Conservative government record. The Prime Minister put a lot of focus on Keir Starmer and his character and his previous career as a lawyer. And the SNP's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, had a bit of a cheeky pop at both of them.
Violent prisoners released early because the Tories wrecked the criminal justice system. 3,500 small boat arrivals already this year because the Tories lost control of the borders. The NHS struggling to see people because the Tories broke it. Millions paying more on their mortgages. A budget that hit pensioners. A £46 billion hole in his sums. Why is the Prime Minister so scared to call an election?
Mr Speaker, as I said in January, my working assumption is that the election will be in the second half of the year. But I must say, I thought that out of everybody, he'd actually be the most grateful, Mr Speaker, because he's now actually got time to come up with a plan for Britain. We're all looking forward to finally seeing it.
We're ready. Just call it. Just call it. But, Mr Speaker, he talks a plan. Let's just take his Rwanda policy. When they first announced this gimmick, they claimed it would settle tens of thousands of people. The Home Office then whittled it down to a mere 300. 4 times that number have already arrived this month, and the backlog stands at 130,000. Can the Prime Minister see any flaw in his plan to deport less than 1% of that backlog?
Since I became Prime Minister, the number of small boat crossings are actually down by over a third, Mr Speaker. And that's because we've doubled National Crime Agency funding, we've increased the illegal enforcement rates by 70%, we've closed 7,500 bank accounts, deported 24,000 illegal migrants, and processed over 112,000 cases, more than at any point in the last 2 decades, Mr Speaker. And it's crystal clear, as we're seeing from the Labour Party's opposition in this House, while we're committed to stopping the boats, the Labour Party would keep them coming.
The tragedy is, we know the Prime Minister doesn't even believe in the Rwanda gimmick. He tried to stop funding it, but he's now so diminished that his entire focus is stopping his MPs holding the sword of Damocles above his head, perhaps even literally in the case of the Leader of the House. His great hope is to percolate his party with a couple of empty planes, praying they won't notice when the flights stop going, the boat's still coming, and the costs keep mounting. How has he managed to spend £600 million of taxpayer money on a gimmick to deport 300 people?
it's crystal clear. Not only does the Labour Party not have a plan to fix this issue, but the truth is they don't actually care about fixing this issue. When he talks about the gangs, when we gave the police new powers to crack down on the people smuggling gangs, he spent months campaigning and voting against it. But thanks to our new laws, 900 criminals have been arrested. 450 have been convicted, serving over 370 years behind bars. If it was up to him, those criminals would still be out on our streets, Mr. Speaker. And the truth is, if he wasn't the Labour leader, he'd still want to be their lawyer.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, with his backbenchers looking for a unity candidate to replace him, which of the now numerous born-again Thatcherites on the Labour front bench does he believe best fits the bill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it was surprising to hear all this talk about the 1970s from the Shadow Chancellor in particular. But then if you see what's happening in places like Birmingham, where taxes are going up by 21%, Mr. Speaker, services are being cut, whether it's social care, children's services, or indeed in some streets, literally the lights are being turned off. It was unsurprising why they're talking about the 70s, and I can just say what they've done to Birmingham, the Conservatives will never let them do to Britain.
There's a very lively Prime Minister's questions there, Susan. Also this week on Wednesday, we had the latest official figures which showed the rate of inflation had fallen to 3.4%. Now, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said this was evidence the government's economic plan was working. Now, the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee grilled the Chancellor this week. Were they convinced by that?
Well, he'll hope he's convinced them. But of course, it's a very august committee with lots of economics experts and the odd former Chancellor on there. So they will probably be running a very sceptical slide rule over everything he has to say. Very different atmosphere to Prime Minister's questions that we've just heard. Much more sedative fare. But still, that election is hanging over everything. And there's a lot of attention on that sort of economic cycle and whether Jeremy Hunt might do another budget-type statement before an election. He did give a hint, actually, talked about October as a possible election date. So there's a lot of excitement about that, maybe outside the committee rather than excitement inside it. They were talking and asking him about something that is likely to dominate any forthcoming election campaign, and that is the effect of his tax cuts that he announced in that budget. And also, of course, whether tax cuts might have a knock-on effect, whether his figures add up and might end up meaning there's a need for cuts to public spending.
I mean, no governments decide a spending review this far ahead of when that spending review is happening. This particular spending review has to be complete before next April, when the next financial year starts. And of course, if the general election is in October, that will mean it's very, very tight.
Do you think the opportunity to increase productivity, does that mean that some of the existing commitment areas can be revisited, or does it all fall on the unprotected areas? And are you comfortable telling the public that this can be achieved without a return to austerity-type cuts?
I don't pretend that 2.5% real terms cuts, which is the IFS modelling, it's not the government's modelling, but you know, if those numbers were correct, I don't pretend that would not be challenging. But I would say that the budget, I announced an agreement with the NHS, which is our biggest public service, which is 40% of all spending on public services, in which they said that they would deliver over the next Parliament 1.9% productivity improvements a year.
Is it realistic then, within those constraints, to think about making progress on increasing defence spending over the next few years?
I think we will need to increase defence spending. We've committed to raising it to 2.5% of GDP as soon as it's affordable. I think it's impossible to look at the world around us and say that it's not becoming significantly more dangerous.
On the whole, do you feel that our growth does depend on high levels of net migration, not merely total GDP, but GDP per person? Is this something which, given the nature of our economy, we really need?
I think that it is definitely the case that migration has contributed significantly to our growth in GDP over many decades. And I think that some controlled migration, filling skills gaps, can have a very important role in increasing GDP per head. But the risk you have is that if you end up with a model that is dependent on unlimited migration, you end up undermining the growth in GDP per head and also creating a lot of social unrest.
Do you think the structure of benefits is something that should be looked at? I think the OBR suggested that perhaps the level of sickness benefit relative to other benefits might have an influence on people's perception of themselves.
I think we do need to keep looking at welfare reform because I think it is incredibly destructive to society if inadvertently and for all the right reasons a system ends up parking people outside the world of work, and we need to be very alive to the risks of that.
The Chancellor getting a grilling there. Thanks, Susan. We'll come back to you again shortly. Let's go over to Cardiff now and to our Wales political correspondent, Rhodri Lewis, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Rhodri, it's been a big week in Welsh politics, hasn't it, with the confirmation of a new First Minister?
Yes, indeed. Vaughan Gething succeeded Mark Drakeford this week. Mark Drakeford said before Christmas that he wanted to stand down from the job after more than 5 years in charge. But during his last appearance at First Minister's Questions here, strangely enough, one of the main topics was the man who's going to succeed him, Vaughan Gething. And that's because there's been a lot of controversy over the £200,000 donation Mr Gething took during his campaign from a company whose owner has been convicted of environmental offences. And there were suggestions that some Labour members here wanted Mr Gething to pay that money back. And that was taken up by Plaid Cymru during their questions to the outgoing First Minister.
Now, I think I'm safe in saying that several members of his own backbenchers think that money should be paid back. It's about putting your hands up to mistakes, as I say, and earning that trust. I ask the First Minister again today, does he think that money should be paid back? And I know he said that he's not in the business of giving grand advice, but given that trust has become such a major issue in the handover of power from him to his successor, what advice would he give him on how to earn that trust?
Well, let me simply say this. I was elected to this Senedd on the same day as the member for Cardiff South and Penarth, and we've always represented parts of this great city. We were placed on the Health Committee together in those very early days. We have worked together when I was the Health Minister and Vaughan Gething was the Deputy Minister for Health. We worked together as closely as you can imagine during those difficult days of the pandemic. I have seen him at work. I know what a careful and considered person he is when it comes to making decisions. He doesn't need advice from me on all of that, and I look forward very much to supporting him and the Welsh Government from the backbenchers.
Now, I should say that Vaughan Gething said that the donations have been declared in the usual way, and he's also made it clear that he doesn't intend returning the money.
And Rhodri, things were a lot more friendly when the former First Minister Mark Drakeford made his resignation statement, weren't they?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the now ex-First Minister is widely respected across all the parties here. Let's face it, this is quite a small parliament. It's just 60 members, so everyone tends to know everybody and pretty much get along with everybody. And he made a farewell speech which was at times emotional when he recalled the sudden death of his wife, Claire, just over a year ago.
For me personally, the last 12 months has been the hardest and the saddest of my life. And people will not see beyond the chamber those small acts of kindness that happen every day from people in every part of this chamber that help someone to get through those very, very difficult times.
And it is a tribute to the fact of your public service that you have brought such dedication and professionalism to the role of First Minister that has earned that respect from leaders across the United Kingdom and beyond. And one of the things that when I go home on a Tuesday night and I say to the family, did you see FMQs today? How did it go? Well, 9 times out of 10, we're knocked out by the snooker or Crown Green bowls or sometimes the darts, and I get the response, didn't see it. But the other times when they have seen it, they do make the point about the passion, the conviction, and the dedication that they can see coming from you as First Minister, but indeed other public servants and other politicians in this building.
First Minister and I have had pretty robust exchanges in this chamber. As a cheese lover myself, I hope those exchanges have been less salty than his beloved Caerphilly cheese. But they have been honest exchanges reflective of our differing priorities, policy platforms and vision for Wales. At a time of political challenges and the deepest personal adversity, Mark brought thoughtfulness and good grace to public life at a time when such qualities were needed the most.
I look forward very much to being a nuisance to you all from the backbenchers, other than the First Minister. Of course, I'll only ever treat with the deepest of respect. But I'm going to be here, and I'm looking forward to being with you all and using the freedom of the backbenchers for some of those more imaginative contributions, which, when you're doing this job, you're a bit constrained from offering. Diolch yn fawr, diolch o galon I chi gyd.
Applause there and some lovely tributes as Mark Drakeford finally steps down as First Minister. But he will, of course, stay on as a member of the Senedd until he retires at the next election in 2 years' time.
So what's on the agenda then for the new First Minister?
Well, first of all, he had to get chosen by the Senedd. And differently to Westminster, we have a system here where there's a vacancy for First Minister, all the members here are asked to nominate. So Plaid Cymru nominated their leader, the Conservatives did the same. But as Labour have the numbers, there was no real doubt that Vaughan Gething would win. And here's a little bit of what he had to say afterwards.
I believe the Wales of today and the future will be owned by all those decent people who recognise that our Parliament and our government should look like our country. People who recognise that our hope and ambition for the future relies on unleashing the talent of all of us. A Wales that recognises that we can celebrate our differences and take pride in all those things that draw us together and make us who we are. That is the Wales that I want to lead. A Wales full of hope, ambition and unity. Diolch, Mr. President. Diolch pawb.
A pretty big week then here in the Senedd and indeed for Welsh politics, because think of this, Vaughan Gething is only the 5th person to lead the Welsh Government since 25 years of devolution, and moreover he's the first black leader of any European nation.
Really interesting times in Wales. Roger Lewis in Cardiff, thank you very much. Let's go to Belfast now and our Northern Ireland political reporter Mark Devonport, who's at Stormont. Mark, 6 weeks after power sharing was restored at Stormont, Northern Ireland's new government is continuing to enjoy something of a honeymoon period. Senior ministers just got back from Washington where they met President Biden. How long do you think this honeymoon can last?
Well, it looks like it's still underway, Charlotte. The First and Deputy First Ministers, Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly, are still enjoying that positive publicity that they garnered during their recent trip to Washington, D.C. But here in Stormont, in the chamber, there's some evidence of tensions over this region's economic relationship with the European Union. Now, that was the key issue which led to this assembly being put out of action for 2 years. In a nutshell, Irish nationalists want Northern Ireland to remain as close as possible to the EU, whilst Unionists are concerned that having to abide by rules set in Brussels will weaken their links to Great Britain. So this week, the DUP objected to a new EU measure which is designed to protect craft products like Murano glass or Donegal tweed. They believe that this new rule could damage Northern Ireland's trade with the rest of the UK.
It was always right for the people of Northern Ireland to have a say when it comes to preventing the application of EU law that is damaging to our economic rights within the United Kingdom. That is exactly why we will be voting against this new EU law, being foisted upon the people of Northern Ireland, and our hope is that others will join with us in using this democratic mechanism to do the same.
What we should be doing today is building on the success of that trip, talking up our potential and giving our young people hope. Instead, we have this motion, in effect a sham fight, which only serves the purpose of undermining the good work of last week and which could sow confusion to potential investors to the north, when what is needed is certainty and stability. I emphasise the point again that dual market access is the key selling point to attract potential investment here to the north.
We are not going to sit here today after this place being down for a lot of years and turn around at the first opportunity after people have made the best impression about Northern Ireland in the US, trying to get jobs, trying to get trade, trying to make sure that we actually increase the people that we have here in work, making sure that we tackle the absolutely awful problems we have with our health service. And I look forward to the day where we make sure that we discuss those things with the exact same vim and energy.
So different views there from nationalists, unionists and centre-ground politicians on this. It will now be up to London and Brussels to decide what, if anything, they want to do to assuage the unionist concerns.
And Mark, that row over EU trading rules is having an impact on some things that you'd least expect, including, as we heard this week, Northern Ireland's budgies.
Charlotte, yes, I hadn't heard a cheep about this until the traditional unionist MLA Jim Allister stood up in the chamber and raised his concerns. He says that the veterinary checks which are required in order to enforce EU standards on Northern Ireland are having a damaging impact on the local budgerigar industry.
I have a constituent in Cullybackey who breeds budgies. Every year or so he brings in a new budgie from England to vary the strain. Now, what does he have to do? He has to have a veterinary certificate in England on the budgie. He has to have a veterinary certificate in Northern Ireland when it arrives. He has to fill in all the paperwork. He has to pay all the fees. Who would have thought that the EU single market was so fragile that the import of a budgie from Cheltenham to Cullybackey puts it at risk?
I didn't expect to hear Mr. Allister talk about the subject of budgie smugglers, but obviously, you know, there are some pleasant surprises await you in the Assembly.
And I think that's the first time I've heard the words budgie smuggling mentioned in the Stormont chamber.
No, I must admit, wasn't expecting that at the start of this week. And the return of the Stormont Assembly not only means that the politicians are back, as we've seen, but also campaigners keen to influence policy. This week, that included a group of teenagers who met the Education Committee. What did they want to tell them?
Yeah, this week we heard from a delegation of young people who gave evidence to the Stormont Education Committee. They raised a number of concerns, including exam stress, bullying, the cost of school uniforms, and the problems that some young teenage asylum seekers are experiencing in accessing education here in Northern Ireland. Now, the MLAs who were questioning them asked the teenagers whether they thought their arguments would be taken more seriously if the voting age was changed and they had the vote at the age of 16.
If you were voting, would policy change quicker?
Yeah, sorry. I definitely think that the voting age being moved down to 16 would be a positive thing. That's something that I I'm very passionate about. I think in that case then young people's voices would be respected, but not even just so much respected that it wouldn't be optional to listen to us. I find that a lot of times when organisations or governments in a way pretend to listen to young people by bringing us in and listening to us, and nothing actually comes out of that. So I think it was Alex that had mentioned some of the recommendations from the UNCRC committee, and I actually went in the beginning of last year to the UN in Geneva, and we presented issues that young people were facing. But when we started that process, we actually looked back at recommendations that had been made, I think it was 5 years pre-COVID, and it was all the same issues that were being brought up, which was sort of demotivating in a way.
Whatever happens to the voting age, that committee session provided plenty of evidence that Northern Ireland has some committed and articulate young campaigners who can certainly give the Assembly members a run for their money.
Potentially some politicians of the future. Mark Devonport at Stormont, thanks very much for bringing us up to date. Now, we've been talking about budgies in Northern Ireland. There was another subject that doesn't often come up in Parliament in Westminster, and Antarctica. Susan, tell us about that.
Yeah, they talk about all sorts in Parliament, and Antarctica is one of them. They've got a whole inquiry going on. The UK has had a permanent presence in Antarctica since the 1940s, apparently, where they've carried out a lot of research into, for example, climate science. But given the length of that time, a great deal of the facilities used by scientists are coming to the end of their lives. So there's a big modernisation programme underway. So they've got a new runway and a new operations base, but it's an incredibly fragile environment. So it's key that any of that doesn't make any damage on that incredibly fragile environment. So Committee of MPs is looking into whether there ought to be more support for this vital research into climate science, but also into this modernisation programme. They wanted to hear a lot about that too.
One of the whole purposes of modernisation, apart from building buildings which are safer and won't burn down and are not losing heat, is to actually reduce our carbon footprint as well, because and make them more sustainable. Because what we have now is not fit for purpose at all. It's some of those are quite dangerous buildings. So I think in the future we will be able to do better science and be better supported and be more safe, which is one of my big topics.
What are you doing in terms of ensuring that, firstly, the environmental considerations when upgrading infrastructure? You've obviously got a new runway, you've got new buildings. How can you ensure that that is as least impactful on the environment as possible, but also in providing the energy that's there that's as energy efficient and zero carbon as possible?
The buildings are much better insulated. We have combined heat and power. So in the past we had generators that were just throwing heat out into the atmosphere, you know, at the same time using tumble dryers next door. I mean, this will all be combined now and be much more efficient. We've got solar panels on the building for use in 6 months of the year, but not through the cold, dark winter, so 50% of the time. And we're also looking at completely different kinds of power. So we're looking at wind turbines, which are quite difficult in Antarctica because we've got a lot of birds around, rather, as you know, so we've got to be careful where we place the wind turbines. Yeah. We can't use anything in the oceans because most ocean energy generators require an open ocean surface, and we have these things, big white things called icebergs, which are highly destructive, so the ocean is not somewhere we can use. But we're trying as best as possible to use everything we possibly can and adapt when new things come online.
Antarctica in Westminster there. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date, Susan. Now that's all for this week. It's also the final edition of Politics UK. After the Easter recess, you'll find coverage and scrutiny of the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments, the Northern Ireland Assembly, the House of Commons and the House of Lords on Politics Live and across BBC News. And of course, you can continue to catch live and recorded parliamentary proceedings from across the UK on the BBC Parliament channel. Bye-bye for now.